Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the debut episode of the En Soma podcast. Whew, I'm doing it. I've been building this up so much in my head, so much so that it is actually kind of terrifying to do this. And at this point, I still don't know if I'm doing this podcast because something deep within me is destined to come out, or if I'm doing this as a form of ego compensation, meaning that I somehow feel insecure and I'm compensating for it by doing a podcast. I really can't tell what this is for me at this point. But of course, the world has its feedback mechanism, so I guess I will soon find out, and perhaps I can just commit to enjoying the process. I must admit, though, I am wrestling with a lot of emotions doing this because to do a podcast like this comes with the recognition that I believe that I have something to say. I have something to say, so much so that I'm now recording myself speak and putting it out there. It's absolutely terrifying, and I'm full of self-doubt. There are certainly voices in my head going, oh my gosh, You have something to say? Do you really think that your thoughts are worth putting out there for people to listen to? But at the same time, I'm also dealing with moderate doses of narcissism and self-inflation. So yeah, how else can I get over this crippling self-doubt without believing in myself to a certain degree? So I'm just going to justify all of this by saying that I guess self-inflation is a requirement to the creative process, to putting myself out there. So I admit this is all quite strange to me. And I bet you're also thinking that this is a very strange introduction to a debut episode. And yes, I would agree. What can I say? But hopefully some of you out there may relate to all this, to the fear, the terror, and the self-doubt that's present whenever you come to realize that something within you needs to be expressed. It's pretty scary. But let's move on, because you don't know me, so perhaps I should introduce myself. My name is Candace, and this podcast is called En Soma. And in this podcast, I want to share things. I want to share stories. I want to share thoughts, perspectives, and perhaps one day I can get others to do this with me. At least that's the hope. And I must say, I really enjoy the podcasting medium. I really like having someone's voice in my ear, telling me stories and giving me perspectives to play with. So En Soma is my contribution to this space. And in this episode, I'm going to present an essay I wrote. It's an essay that I wrote about spirituality and how to properly initiate yourself into adulthood through spirituality. And this essay is specifically speaking to those people out there who are somewhat allergic to anything spiritual. Those non-religious, secular-minded folks out there who often mock spirituality or portray it as some sort of weakness. In my essay, I will counter this, and I'll present a perspective that says that actually spirituality is necessary in order for all of us to realize our full potential as adults. So let's get going. Episode 1, The Uninitiated. Children trapped in adult bodies, and the spiritual antidote. In many respects, I'm a fresh, newly minted adult. And even on the outside, I look and I act like an adult. I'm in my 30s, I have a house, a family, responsibilities, bills, and chores. I am adulting. I'm doing the day-to-day grind. And time is flying by quickly, and most days I'm entrenched in a mixture of monotony and anxiety, and only my routines can soothe me. But sprinkled throughout the day are little moments of love and beauty and joy that make it all worth it. However, it wasn't that long ago that I was in the university, shielded by the identity of being a student, where I was preparing to be an adult. And it also wasn't that long ago that I was in high school living with my parents. it was only about 5 or 6 years ago that I was plunged into adult working life. So like I said, I'm a new adult. And in some ways, I'm adulting very well, but in other ways, I'm not. Becoming an adult has been wonderful, but it's also been pretty shocking and disappointing. After university and school life, I had to deal with a lot of big existential questions like, who am I? What do I want? Is this really what adult life is like? And is this really what I prepared my whole life for? So as you probably can already tell, what I am describing is a typical quarter-life crisis. And I'm sure many of you out there can relate to this. It's like this moment when you come off autopilot and you're like, what the fuck? What the fuck have I been doing? What is all this? And it's a really heavy thing to go through something like this, and often people completely change their lives after a crisis like this. But I can tell you, thanks to years of deep psychoanalysis, I'm doing much better. I'm doing much better. I've kind of moved on from this crisis. I have been in Jungian analysis for the past 2 years, and if you don't know what that is, it's a form of therapy created by Carl Jung, who is considered to be the father of analytical psychology. And this type of therapy is like going on a scuba diving expedition into the subconscious. But unlike hypnosis or other types of therapy where you are exploring the subconscious, I'm completely aware and I'm completely awake. It's a fully conscious practice. And let me tell you, it's a big, beautiful world down there in the unconscious. And as an analysand, that's a person who sits in the therapy chair. There's an analyst and there's an analysand. As an analysand, I've learned a lot, and my wish is to share some of the lessons with you in case they prove useful in your life. They may not, but they might as well. So in that spirit, I want to offer a perspective on something that I'm usually pretty terrified to talk about, and that something is spirituality. This is not an easy topic for me to talk about because it's often so stigmatized, particularly by people who identify as non-religious or atheist. For example, just recently I mentioned the term spirituality just casually in conversation with a colleague, and I was talking about a mutual friend of ours who, after a very hard time, has fortunately found quite a lot of relief in spirituality. And when I told my colleague this, he reacted to this word, spirituality, almost like the way folks in Harry Potter would react incredulously when someone would explicitly say the name Voldemort. And even worse than that, there was a lot of judgment. There was like this sentiment of like, oh no, she's gone off the deep end, or oh gosh, she didn't have the grit to withstand a godless existence, or like this, oh how fortunate it is to lose an otherwise great and wise person to the nonsense and to the absurd. And I admit I was pretty triggered by this, and therapy taught me that what triggers me often has more to do with my own inner state than it does anything else. So putting myself in the therapy chair, I'm pretty positive that one of the reasons why I was so bothered by this is because I myself was one of these people for such a long time. I was pretty resistant to anything spiritual. I was fully in my head, and I clung to certainty like my life depended on it. So in many ways, this essay is kind of for my former self. And I know that spirituality is a very loaded word. Many people out there find this word particularly revolting or offensive because it brings up connotations of practices or communities or cultures that they find distasteful. And I also want to mention that people really can't or don't agree on what this word means. It means different things to different people. And I also must admit that it's taking me an absurd amount of courage to talk about this. I've had to overcome some mental hurdles to be open about the subject because for a long time, I have been practicing spirituality in secret. And I mean, who out there can relate to this? Practicing spirituality in the shadows because those around you would find it a sign of weakness or would label you as one of those people. Well, fuck it. I am talking about it now because there are good reasons why human beings need spirituality. Now, one of the reasons why I feel this stigma so much is because I grew up in a secular culture. Yes, my culture is influenced by Judeo-Christian philosophy, stories, and values, no doubt, but I didn't grow up particularly religious. I grew up around religious people here and there, but otherwise I grew up in a pretty secular setting. My family isn't religious, my teachers weren't outwardly religious, and most of my peers, colleagues, and friends and acquaintances throughout my life have been or are not religious. Most people I know are either non-religious or actively anti-religious, and those who are more active in their anti-religious sentiments are often very judgmental about spirituality. Many of the people I know believe that people who engage in spirituality are doing it out of weakness, as if they can't cope with the day-to-day struggles, or that the traumatic load of existence is just too burdensome, that they have to somehow outsource it to a higher power. And the world is pretty nuanced, so there may be some small truth to this. I don't think that it is totally true. I don't think people practicing spirituality are just cases of delicate minds being manipulated by Godspeak. Like I said before, I don't think spirituality is solely about escaping and coping. Rather, I think it's mainly about self-realization, liberation, and self-actualization. Processes that I claim are important to realizing one's full potential in adulthood, and especially these days, where many in the Western societies feel a crisis of the soul. And I must say, I feel it too. It's like we are collectively rethinking how we live. I think many of us are looking at our societal structures and we just know something is not right. That the way that we've built our lives is simply not working out for us. And I think many of us are feeling the desperation that comes with the realization that many of our days are entrenched in meaningless action. And to be honest, it all feels pretty shitty. There's an anxiety in the air, a tension, a knowing that we are reaching a point of no return, and it's all pretty scary. And there's a knowing that the structures we have built are simply not working out for us or the planet. And in culturally Western places where I grew up, like the US, things are starting to feel pretty dystopian. There's simply an undeniable and lingering feeling that we are reaching a tipping point. And I think many of us are feeling it with all of these social and environmental reckonings, where we see that we cannot go on the way we have been, or times feel extreme and psychologically trying. And I don't know about you, but there are many days that I just don't cope well with all of this. But I have to say here that it's not all doom and gloom from where I'm sitting, because although I experience despair from time to time, I'm not always swimming in it. I do have hope. And I do take comfort in knowing that I have agency. I have agency in my own life, and I can choose my experience to a large degree. And this agency has become more apparent to me the more I've engaged in spiritual processes. Okay, I have to kind of stop here and, just point out that there's something pretty comical about how I'm presenting this point of like, hey, are you not coping with adulthood well? Are you tired of the real world? Well, let me tell you about the spiritual world. And yes, there's some comedy to it. I am being cheeky, but there also is some truth that spirituality can just be a giant way to cope with shit. But the point I'm trying to make beyond this comedy is that spirituality is much more than that. For me, it's not just an escape from the struggles of the real world or an act of surrender to a higher something or other. It can be that for many people. And that's fine. There is a lot of surrender in spirituality, but what I want to claim is that spirituality is something more fundamental to the human experience. And I would agree with Carl Jung that humans have an instinct for it. So, here's kind of a definition for you. Just a definition for my more secular-minded audience who need to kind of understand what I mean by this term, spirituality. So spirituality, at its core, when you strip it down to its basic elements, Spirituality is simply a process of introspection. It's the process of redirecting your attention, your energy, your focus, and all of your inquiries from the external world and moving all of that focus on the internal. It's the process of addressing the big question of who am I? And I'm not talking about your identities or your affiliations. Those really aren't you. I'm talking about your most inner essences, the unique expression that is you. So that's all spirituality has to be. Now, of course, it can be more. It can be a connection to the divine. It can be more experiential. It can be more ritualistic, ceremonious, and sacred. It could contain myth or story, but my point is that it doesn't have to be. If it does include all those things, that's fine, but it doesn't have to be, because essentially all it has to be is a process of introspection. It's just carving space and time out of our lives to just focus on our inner experience. And this can look different for everyone. It can be just meditating a few minutes a day, journaling our feelings, talking to a friend. It could be moving, it could be breathing. Basically anything that brings us in and helps us focus on our inner world, our emotional, mental, and psychological world. And let me say this, our dear working institutions are starting to realize this as well. For example, emotional intelligence is all the rage right now. And while I don't really have a problem with this concept, I find it funny that we have just recently collectively discovered that we are actually far less rational than we think we are. And that emotions are fundamental to the human experience, including the workplace. And that actively working with our emotions is a good thing to do if we want to live better lives. So, right there, bam, that's introspection. And that's what I would also call spirituality. And I can imagine that many of you out there, really don't feel such a big issue with this definition that spirituality is just a process of introspection, but you might just be more hung up on this word spirituality because it contains this root, this word spirit, and you don't really like this word because it has such big religious connotations, or it contains or implies a story that you just don't believe in. And that's fine. I could go into this word later. I'm just going to say that I'm just not going to go into debating that because I feel like I have a lot more important things to say. And I personally think that spirituality as a term actually encompasses pretty well, or encapsulates pretty well, the processes that I'm describing. So with that, let's go ahead and move forward. All right, so these days I consider spiritual work to be the great initiation into adulthood. Because oftentimes what happens is that through the process of introspection, we learn so much about why we act the way we act and why we think the way we think. And it's through this introspective work that we essentially learn who we are, and we learn what burdens we've been carrying since childhood and adolescence. And it's only then that we can fully realize our potential as adults. For example, it wasn't until I started this kind of introspective therapy work that I realized that a lot of my psyche was stuck or stunted in images and patterns from my childhood or teenage years. And sometimes it seems like I'm surrounded by people who, just like me, are just children in adult bodies with adult responsibilities. And all of us are what I would call the uninitiated. So let me explain what I mean by initiation. Initiations are often thought of as rites of passage, a transition from one stage of life to another. And I'm thinking about ritual initiations that revolve around one's coming of age, like the quinceañera in Latin America, or the Jewish bar mitzvah, and the many tribal initiations around the time of puberty. All of these ceremonies signify the transitions from childhood to adolescence and from adolescence into adulthood. And in the West, these sorts of ritual or ceremony initiations are not so widely practiced. And many psychologists, particularly in the Jungian school, consider this to be a great loss. For example, Robert Moore and Doug Gillette, however you pronounce his last name, in their book on the mature masculine archetypes, they talk in their introduction about how detrimental the loss of ritual processes is on our psyche. They go on to attribute this loss to movements such as the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. And they claim that these cultural movements discredited the ritual processes and essentially threw out the baby with the bathwater. Which, for those who don't know what this expression means, it basically means that in getting rid of all the unwanted stuff in something, they accidentally threw out the most valuable thing. They also go on to argue that, in turn, because of this loss of ritual processes, that we've created a society of people that are essentially psychologically immature. Of course, this book mostly focuses on boys and men. It is about masculine archetypes, but I'm extending their words to refer to just people in general. And I know that this might seem like a harsh statement, that we are kind of fundamentally psychologically immature, but I must admit that I'm inclined to agree with them. I say this as an adult in my 30s with a proper 9-to-5 existence, who after a lot of introspection and psychotherapy has come to know all too well the ways in which I am immature and all the ways that my psyche has been stunted in childhood and adolescence. Now let me turn to Anthony Stevens, because in his introduction on Carl Jung, he illustrates Jung's unique perspective on these things in a section called Life's Program. So he goes on to explain that Jung's approach to developmental psychology greatly contrasted with the predominant views of his time. The orthodox view at the time was that humans were mere responsive organisms, which built up behaviors through conditioning and learning based on outer stimuli. So basically what we perceive and sense. It's basically the nurture idea of development. Jung, on the other hand, believed that, and I quote, human beings were born with an elaborate program for life, which presupposed the natural life cycle of humanity and was incorporated in the self, end quote. The self that Jung refers to is the totality of consciousness. Some have likened it to the soul. So when I read this, I think of an acorn growing into an oak tree. It's just born, well, acorns are born, but it's just has that program for life in it. And this idea is based in Jung's idea of the collective unconscious and archetypes, which, if you aren't familiar, archetypes are primordial patterns, behaviors, and images that exist in a level of our consciousness that's universal, that we all share. And it's these archetypes that affect our personalities and our behaviors in unique ways. And Jung believed that the inner program contained stages. For instance, in the primary phases of childhood and adolescence, the inner program is concerned with the biological and the social. And then when one grows older, the aim of the inner program shifts and becomes more cultural and spiritual. Namely, there is a shift from exploration and effort in the outer world to effort and exploration in the inner world. And Stephen points out that transitioning between different phases in these programs can be a time of great potential crisis. And therefore, many cultures and societies conducted initiations or rites of passages to enable these transitions and help people psychologically move forward, especially around puberty, which is a significant marker of maturation. And in true Jungian fashion, he states that these rituals provided, and I quote, great value because they provided the public affirmation of the fact that a significant transition had occurred, and that through the powerful symbolism of the ritual, these rituals activated archetypal components in the collective unconscious appropriate to the life stage that had been reached. Unquote. So more or less, these initiates experience a psychological transition, one that is recognized by their community. So to offer an example, when a young female initiate participates in a menstrual ceremony upon experiencing her first cycle, what essentially happens is that she activates the psychic potential of her womanhood. And also, those who initiate her recognize her as a woman. And through these processes, something within our psychology and our psyche is activated, something that's necessary for the transition. Now, reflecting on my own experience, I never really had any sort of rite of passage. I've had some things that one could consider to be quasi-initiations, like, for example, going to the prom or attending graduation ceremonies, etc. But nothing too profound or sacred. There wasn't anything like where the intention was to transition me to womanhood or adulthood. And also, reflecting on this, I actually feel that most of the depictions that I've encountered growing up were pretty dismissive of these rituals, and they often just mocked them. For instance, one scene that comes to mind, which some of you might remember, is when Steve-O from Jackass, just to perform a stunt, participated in a tribal ritual where young men put their hand in a glove containing ants, and these ants apparently had an excruciating bite. And the whole thing was really a terrible shit show. But, I certainly found it funny when I was a teenager. But then the only other scene that comes to mind apart from Steve-O was Ace Ventura, which I forget which movie it was, but the main character, who is an American played by Jim Carrey, is a guest to a tribe, which I believe was in Africa. I'm sorry, I'm being very ambiguous with the descriptions. I truly don't remember, but you kind of have the idea. And there was a young man in the tribe that was undergoing his initiation into adulthood, which meant that he had to balance on top of a totem for various days. And the main character spat spitwads at him through a straw because he found it amusing. So these are some of the images I have in me about how my culture feels about these tribal initiations. And of course, I can also understand why collectively there's some hesitation about initiations. Many puberty rites are absolutely brutal and involve what feels like an extreme and unnecessary amount of discomfort or suffering. And many rites nowadays can feel just too commercial or like they're a big money grab. I'm thinking about like weddings or baby showers. And of course, not all initiations are about marking life stages. Some of them just might mean or signify the joining of a community. And there have been many negative headlines over the decades about initiations that have just gone too far, like gang initiations or fraternity initiations. And these initiations can be just downright disturbing or immoral and disgusting. For instance, at my university in Kentucky, one fraternity and its members got into a lot of trouble, and it might actually have been shut down, I don't remember, for making initiates do some pretty unsavory things to farm animals. So I could understand why many of us don't have the best image or connotation of the practice of initiations. But let me just elaborate a bit more on why this is necessary. And I'll start off by offering a personal observation of things I see in my own resident country. So I live in Finland. I'm originally from the United States, but now I have found a new home in Finland. And there's something very interesting about the Finnish society, because the Finnish society forces young men to serve at least 6 months to a year in the army, usually around the age of 18. Now, there are a lot of conversations ongoing among Finns about whether or not they support this, and many actually find this practice sexist, as it only targets men. Many Finns argue that if we want equality, this should be mandatory for women as well, or completely optional for everyone. But I digress. But my point is that I have noticed from my own personal observations that Finnish men seem more independent than men from other cultures that I've encountered. Because one thing that happens when these teenage boys leave for the army is that there is a necessary separation from the parental home, especially from the mother or the main caregiver. And from the stories I've heard, the army is full of trials and challenges, and it can be very unpleasant. But if you're ever in Finland and you're with a group of Finnish men, you'll hear them swap talk about their days in the army. And many have told me that although it was tough at times, they overall concluded that it was a very significant experience for them. Now again, this is just my own personal observation, and I'm generalizing a lot. And I feel like I'm entering into territory where I might get crucified for saying this, but just take this with a grain of salt. But Finnish men, in my own experience, don't seem to be as attached to their mothers as other men that I have encountered from other cultures, including from my own culture in the United States. And what I mean by this is that Finnish adult men don't seem like they're still living at their mother's house psychologically. That's not to mean that they don't respect or that they don't love their mother. Rather, they just aren't trapped in this psychological dynamic where they're thinking of themselves still as children to their mother, rather just in an adult body. So even though this is probably not the aim of the Finnish army, I would hypothesize that it overall serves as a quasi-initiation into adulthood for Finnish men. And sometimes I wonder what it would be like if they actually made this a conscious intention. Now, I don't want to just pick on men, because any adult can still be trapped in their parental home. For example, it's actually taking me a lot of therapeutic unraveling to help me leave my parents' home. The parents are just such a strong and foundational image in the psyche that unless there's a deliberate separation, one can really stay like a child in adulthood. So overall, I really think the initiation processes are important. But I must admit as well, and I want to make this very clear, that I have no idea what we should do about this culturally and as a society. I don't know what would make a good contemporary rite of passage for bringing the youth of today into adulthood. I don't know what would be the right initiation to separate us psychologically from childhood and leave our parental home. And I'm definitely not arguing that we should just mimic tribal initiations and rites. But there are some core lessons that we can learn from observing various native cultures, their stories, their rituals, and how they enable their youth to mature. What I can say, however, is that perhaps Western culture and Western knowledge can add something useful on top of all this. So that instead of just this transition phase being solely ritualistic and ceremonious, one actually, in addition to all of this, goes through a deep process of introspection, a process of self-realization and liberation. Not only just performing the rite to move forward into adulthood, but also doing the necessary introspective work that unravels all of these obsolete and harmful patterns that were built up when we were young. So let me explain this a little bit further. So I come from a background in education, and it's well known in my field that in a person's life, there are two critical developmental periods, and those periods are childhood and adolescence. And adolescence, according to new neuroscience, ends at around the age of 25, kind of right before people have their quarter-life crisis. And it's in these two periods, more so than any other period in our life, that we are fundamentally building our understanding of ourselves, the world around us, and how we should act and behave in relation to other people. So if I can just offer a quote from the article called Why Ages 2 to 7 Matter So Much for Brain Development. I'll put the link in the notes. So start quote. Children's brains develop in spurts called critical periods. The first occurs around age 2, and the second one occurring during adolescence. At the start of these periods, the number of connections, synapses, between brain cells, otherwise known as neurons, what happens is that these connections double. 2-year-olds have twice as many synapses as adults. Because these connections between brain cells are where learning occurs, twice as many synapses enable the brain to learn faster than at any other time in life. Therefore, children's experiences in this phase have lasting effects on their development. End quote. So more or less what this tells us is that in these formative years, we are fundamentally developing our brains. And this is why when we are sitting in the therapy chair as adults, we have to look at the past and at our childhood and unpack patterns, conditioning, and coping mechanisms that are built in childhood. And the unfortunate thing about all of this is that our formative years also happen to be our most vulnerable and dependent years. And attachment is the imperative for survival. Attachment to family, peers, and culture. So a lot can happen in our youth that can fundamentally shape us for how we will be as adults. And there are many expressions out there that say something to the effect of, show me a person's first 7 years of life, and I will be able to reliably tell you how they will be as adults. So having a great spiritual initiation can help us examine, unravel, and heal a lot of the formations that are no longer serving us. All of these formations that were built in childhood unconsciously and for good reason, to survive, to please family, and to feel loved, but they are no longer serving us. And I'm talking about traumas, patterns, images, and coping mechanisms that are rooted in these fundamental years, but we carry them as adults. They still affect us until we decide that we need to do something about it through processes of deep introspection. Doing something about this requires us to bring all of this to our consciousness. And there's a famous quote by Carl Jung that states, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And I know this to be true. Not just in a theoretical sense, but in an experiential one. I have lived this. I can attest that shining the light of consciousness on things that were previously hidden and buried in the unconscious, it's so healing and it's so transformative. But before moving on, I want to make a quick side note or a distinction here, especially for those who are doing inner child work. But before moving on, I want to make a quick side note or a quick distinction here, especially for those out there who are doing inner child work. What I'm not trying to do is demonize childhood. I'm not saying that we need to do something like abandon or kill our inner child. Actually, even saying that is pretty hard to say. And to be honest, that would be very harmful for the psyche. It's not that childhood is bad. What I'm essentially calling for is a removal of things that were built in childhood that no longer serve us as adults. And let me offer 2 examples to illustrate how childhood patterns can hold us back when we are adults. So one of the main reasons why I went to therapy to begin with is because I felt like I couldn't feel or connect with or understand my emotions. I felt disconnected from my body, and I felt like all of my energy was in my head. I really felt like a floating head, just floating bodiless through life. And when I took the necessary time and space to examine this, I noticed that I dissociated from my emotions for many reasons. Because as a child, my emotions felt dangerous, and I'm pretty sensitive. So at one point or another, and there's not one specific point, I just unconsciously detached from my emotions in order to cope. Just somewhere along the way, my child brain said, nope, I'm not going to feel that pain or that sorrow. It's too much. And I did this unconsciously for good reasons. It helped me then. But as an adult, this created a personality where my emotions were operating in weird and subtle ways because I just had issues expressing them in a direct way. For example, when I was angry with someone, I wouldn't feel anger in the typical way. I would usually bury it so that no one would know that it was there, or I would channel it into something really weird, like getting frustrated with politics. I couldn't just be angry when I was angry. And I was often told that I had kind of these robotic reactions to things that warranted emotional responses. To be honest, I would just freeze up. And now as an adult, this is a serious problem because emotions contain vitality. I mean, how will I ever realize my creative potential if I can't connect with my emotions? How can I express myself if I'm detached from my feelings? So this is an example of something that was fundamental in my childhood, but it was not working for me as an adult. And fortunately, I can report that I have gotten better with this, but I still have a ways to go. Now, allow me to stop here with a disclaimer. For any parents out there that are feeling a bit queasy about all of this and they're tired of people with their psychobabble pointing the finger at them with an air of blame, I get it, but you have to understand that while the parental image is foundational to a person's psyche, it's useless to think of this as a blame game. I mean, I had very young parents who did their best and struggled a lot to make a good life for us. And I can imagine that this kind of psychoanalysis talk can feel very harsh on parents who are really trying to do their best. But it's important to remember that regardless of what sort of childhood you had, every single one of us is going to have impressions from childhood that are no longer serving us. Because like I mentioned before, childhood is fundamental, but also vulnerable. And attachment and survival are the imperatives. So a lot can get twisted or repressed or buried in an effort to stay connected. And the psychological solutions to problems in a child's mind can be very childish. For example, trauma can be a little bit funny. It doesn't always have to be the most obvious and worst forms of trauma. For example, let's say that when you were a child around 3 or so years old, you drew a picture that you were so proud of. You were so proud of it that you went to show it to your mom, and as you approached her, she had just spilt really hot coffee all over herself. And she's cursing and wiggling in pain, and in her pain, she lashes out at you, like, not now, go play. And you as a child, being kind of self-absorbed as children are, you don't see the whole situation. And therefore you draw the conclusion that your art makes mommy angry, so you shouldn't draw anymore. Or you definitely shouldn't approach her with your art in the least. And you carry that wonky memory or this impression all the way into adulthood, where your relationship with creating visual art is somewhat painful and you don't know why. Now, this is kind of a silly example, but I hope it demonstrates that the patterns, impressions, and coping mechanisms that we build in our youth are conjured by the developing and vulnerable mind of a child. And these things are not only just the results of specific events. Children often inherit the shadows, the fears, and anxieties and behaviors of their parents and their family, even their peers. And all of this is unconscious. So sometimes it's not just about how the parents or the family directly engages with the child, because what's in the hearts and minds of the family are often imprinted on the child in some form or fashion. And again, this can give parents a lot of anxiety, but I want to reassure everyone that it's part of the quest. It's part of the quest of every child to go through this, grow up, and individuate into adulthood. Now, of course, this is not to say, hey, don't worry about fucking up your kid because it's part of their quest. We don't want to rob them of their quest. We want to make their quest as big and meaningful as possible. That's not what I'm trying to say. My point is that being a good enough parent is good enough. And no parent can insulate their child completely. They will also have to deal with peers and teachers and other family members and just society in general. And they're going to, of course, leave impressions that you can't control. And let me also just say that not everything that we inherit in our youth is bad. There are many things that I was given and that I have inherited when I was a child from my parents and my peers and my culture that I will definitely keep. But there are many, many things that just simply need to go. And part of this process of initiating into adulthood is examining these things closely and distinguishing what will stay and what will go. And I also kind of want to add another disclaimer here. And I just want to emphasize that I'm not trying to blame children. For instance, I'm not trying to blame my childhood or my childhood self for the formations, impressions, and mechanisms that were built in me when I was a child. That would be pretty counterproductive, especially in terms of healing and moving forward and getting past my childhood. I'm not saying that we should blame children for being children. That's really an awful thought. Again, what I'm imploring everyone to do is to not think of this as a blame game. And of course, there are some people out there that might feel this is very dismissive, especially in circumstances where parents were simply bad parents, and trauma wasn't just subtle or minor occurrences. Rather, trauma was very extreme, and I realize that. This is all very complicated territory, and what I'm trying to express is that through spiritual processes, I realized that there was stuff there lurking in my past that I needed to deal with. And it was stuff that was holding me back. And it was really tough to work through it all. And I had good enough parents. So I can only imagine what it's like to do this kind of work when you've had truly bad parents and have some very severe trauma to work out. And I only have admiration for those people. In fact, I have people in my family who have been through this type of trauma, and I can see how it affects their lives and how it burdens them as adults. So I just wanted to step in here and say that this is not really about blaming the adult or blaming the child. Even though at some points in the therapy process, using blame can be healing and helpful. For instance, being angry and letting anger come out and having moments where you can say things like, "You did this to me," it can be helpful. And this is not me giving a pass for people to stay in a victim mentality. My point is that at certain parts of the healing process, blame is useful, but overall, in the big picture, blame is counterproductive. Okay, so that was all pretty nuanced, so let's move forward. So before I gave a personal example of how I struggle with emotional dissociation and how that has affected me in my childhood and how I carry that on into my adulthood. But let me offer another example of how gifts can be repressed in youth. It's not just the bad stuff, but also the good stuff can be stunted in childhood. And here I'll give the example of the classic and beautiful wild child. The child that is so intrigued by the world and is somehow always covered in mud with messy hair and dirty clothes. This kind of wild child finds the world and all the little things in it so curious and wonderful, and their intrigue affords them with tons of energy to explore it all. But unfortunately, in the world of daily routines and rhythms, the wild child is forced to behave. They're forced to sit still and be proper and to put all of their wild energy on a shelf or bury it in the ground because it's not so pleasing to the adults around them, or it's just too much for them to deal with. And this wild child, they grow into adulthood, but deep within, they still are that behaving and obedient child who is repressing their wild instincts because at some point or another, they were told to stop. They were told that it was wrong. And as an adult, their world feels empty and lackluster. And this is really tragic. But part of the quest of the spiritual initiation is to realize the tragedy, reverse it, and reclaim all of those gifts. And let me tell you, when it comes to repression, a lot of energy is used burying that stuff down. And when you dig it up, you free up a lot of energy with it. A lot of us repress these gifts in order to be accepted as we are growing up. I mean, how many of us do whatever it takes to fit in with our peers during our adolescent years? I know I personally lost myself completely during that time in my life, and it's taken a lot of work to come back to myself and reclaim all of the things that I unconsciously put away because I was afraid that people wouldn't like it. So what I hope I've been successful in demonstrating with these examples is that realizing our full potential in adulthood requires an introspective initiation. A process where we look within and examine ourselves and do the work of unraveling any patterns or inhibitions that may be holding us back. And I'll say this, we cannot do this work if all of our time, attention, and energy is focused on the external world. It's important to carve out space and time in our days to focus on this. And we have to do it ourselves because our society, particularly in the West, doesn't have any structures or traditions or anything in the culture to help us psychologically separate from our childhood. For example, our schooling does not help with this. Schools are preparing us to participate in the two dominant institutions of society, and that is consumer capitalism and representative democracy. And both of these institutions, both capitalism and democracy, require active participation. You can't have a democracy without voters, and you can't have capitalism without buyers and sellers. So our schooling is really focused on the external world and preparing us for that kind of society. We learn about what things are, we learn about what they do, we learn about how we can use them, and we learn about stories that help us understand our society and our history. But there's nothing that we learn that helps us navigate our own internal experience. Churches before were the predominant institution for that. But for many good reasons, we are breaking away from the church as the main structure of our spirituality. But one of the consequences of this is that there's a gaping void in our culture. A gaping void in our culture that doesn't support the inner quest. And there's nothing to intentionally launch us into the realm of adulthood. So it's up to us, like I mentioned before, to do this work ourselves. And how you start this spiritual process is completely up to you. It could be journaling, meditating, psychotherapy. If you can't already tell, I'm a big advocate of that. But my point is that what this looks like in your life will depend on you. And there will be so many people out there telling you what to do and how to do it. There's always gurus and priests and people with so-called authority that promise salvation in some form or another. And they claim that there's only one right way to do any of this. At some point, I would like to actually do an episode on that there's a big shadow side to spirituality and why we need a lot of strong integrity to navigate through it. But my point is that you can start with whatever feels right for you. All you have to do to start this is to find a way to carve out space and time in your life to remove the gaze from the outside world and focus it inward. Examine your inner experience. And I know that this can be a challenge because there are so many demands on us day to day, and I'm saying all this at the expense of sounding like another person just telling you what to do. I mean, I feel this kind of pressure too. And there are periods in my life where I just don't do much for my internal world. And if you need help, there are loads of resources out there. If you want to start journaling, just buy a journal and just write how you're feeling every day. Or open up the recorder app on your phone and just start talking to yourself and reflecting on your own internal experience. You don't ever have to share it. Or if you want to just try being an observer of your own thoughts and feelings, there are many meditation apps out there and resources online. You don't have to do anything grand. Just commit time every day to your own initiation. You can start with something simple and just start with a small habit and just see where it goes. And it might lead to other spiritual tools and practices. And just know that this work is not only important for you, but it's important for our society. You might have heard that when we take an individual problem seriously, we are at the same time solving a social problem. And I truly believe this. I believe that if you want to fix the world, you have to start with fixing yourself. It's not always about what we do. It's also about how we are in our state of being. If we pay attention, we can see that the hearts and minds of individuals, they're reflected outward. It makes up society. And therefore, I am society and you are society too, just by being. It's not always about what we do. Our emotions and our thoughts have a societal impact. I mean, anger and rage can fester and poison the minds of crowds. Sadness and grief can be felt collectively. And we all know what it's like to be around a person whose joy is infectious. Our subtle ways of being are connected to the world and to everyone else. So do you remember in the beginning when I ranted on about how adulthood feels very tough, especially these days where everything feels like we are approaching a grand end? And while there are many actions that we can take to help with this in terms of how we participate in capitalism and democracy, something that can help us connect to our power is to start our own spiritual process. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that I think everyone should just stop participating in the world and retreat into a cave and meditate and pray that all of these problems go away. To live in our society, we do have to act. We do have to participate. And while both capitalism and democracy, they have their flaws, and many times they feel like rigged systems, we at least have a lot of agency to choose how we can participate. And what the spiritual process can do for us as we are engaging with the tumultuous times that we are living in is that it gives us a grounding, a sense of integrity, a knowing of who we are and what we can do. And eventually, ideally, it can offer us a basic sense of security. That no matter how the wind blows around us, we are rooted, we know who we are. And another thing that these spiritual processes do is that they free up energy and potential to prosper as an adult and act in the world uninhibited by the things that no longer serve us. It gives us the ability to contribute the most value that we can in our lifetime. And many have argued that we have a moral imperative to do this kind of work. They have argued that we have a moral obligation to figure out what value we can offer and then offer it to our communities and our societies. That we have an obligation to realize and act on our potential. And what I'm adding on top of all of this is that we cannot do this without that spiritual initiation. The process of introspection, we can't do it. We can't do it until we examine our inner world. So as we are doing our thing in adulting, I invite you to consider embarking on your own spiritual initiation. It's not always an easy journey, but it's worth it. And if my experience counts for anything, it has certainly helped me emerge into my potential as a person on this planet. And I'll continue to do this work in some form or fashion for the rest of my life. All right, let's wrap this up, shall we? I did it. I did my first episode. After I got into it, it actually wasn't so bad. But now I got to do the thing of putting myself out there and letting people receive it, and that comes with a whole other sort of terror. But overall, I'll deal because I'm proud of myself for doing this, and especially about a topic that I've been so scared to talk about, because it's something so essential to what I think and feel. I don't have much experience putting myself out there, and it is scary, but I did it. And if you're still there, I thank you so much for listening in on my debut episode. Take care.